Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Longtime listeners know that doctoral degree is in Romance, language, literature, and linguistics. My area of specialty was Spanish literature, but I absolutely love French literature. My brain is so happy when it is working on any sort of French language, anything. And that is part of the reason why today we are going to talk about Philippe Besson's En l'absence des hommes. This is a book that I was drawn to because I saw it on that front table of that same independent bookstore in New York City, the one that led me to Lost Lambs and recently my year in Paris with Gertrude Stein. In the Absence of Men had actually been there quite a few times. I had walked in and seen it. It's the cover, the American cover, I find so appealing. I had read Lie With Me, which came out in 2019, also obviously by Besson. It was translated by Molly Ringwald, which I thought was so interesting at the time, and I loved that book. Turns out it was somewhat autobiographical. It told the story of a young man in France in the countryside who falls in love with someone, and it's a bit of a saga, obviously, as the best books are. And I really loved it. When I turned the book over and looked at the back of the jacket copy, I was even more intrigued. We find out that we are in the year 1916, and then we find out that one of the main characters in the book is a writer named Marcel P. And I'm going to say right here at the top that there was some very bold things, not only the idea of taking on the voice of Marcel Proust, but there was like a very bold thing that happens in the novel. There's a really important twist. And I will say, I was on an airplane when I got to the twist. I turned the page, I saw what was going to happen, and I did this kind of like gasp, and then I kind of chuckled a little. I actually laughed a little bit out loud because honestly, it did not feel necessary. It felt earned in some ways. Like when I thought back about what I had been reading, I was like, oh, okay, I understand why this twist is going to work. But it was at the very end of the novel, and it felt in some ways kind of gratuitous and sort of gimmicky. It worked for me on some level, which is impressive because I also felt like it was kind of gimmicky. This is a book that got good reception. It's very popular. So I think that worked actually for a lot of people. And it was a very, very bold kind of twist that this book makes at the end. And part of me was like, wow, did everybody just think the ending was great? So I went and I did a little more research. And what I found out is that this is a book that Philippe Besson published in 1999. This was his very first novel. Actually, I think he published it in 2001, maybe 2001 in the United States, but right around the turn of the millennium. I was like, okay, that makes so much more sense to me. In many, many ways, this to me feels like a first novel, like a very, very good first novel. And Besson is someone who's written 23 novels. So my suspicion is that Lie With Me comes out in the United States and it does very well. And so they're like, okay, we need another novel. And they're like, let's give the Americans the part about Marcel Proust because they're all going to really love that, which is true. And it is a novel that's like full of history and all of these kinds of different elements that I do think are very appealing to people. And that to me felt very much like a first novel. Like this is someone, he was in law school at that point. He was, I think, around 33 years old. I have this idea that he's like, okay, I'm going to write a novel. I'm going to figure out like, what if this thing happened with Marcel Proust? And then I'm going to work backward from there and sort of construct a story around this concept. It's kind of like a high concept novel. Not really, but like you have this idea of someone being like, okay, if I'm going to write a first novel, there has to be like some big revelation. And this is how we're going to get there. And once I realized that this was a very early novel of Besson, I kind of like, I mean, frankly, I was all the more impressed because the prose is really beautiful. It's incredibly well constructed. And I also really like forgave any kind of like gimmicky kind of feel with this big turn that happens, this big twist at the end. I assume most people have read this, have finished the novel already, but I'm not going to talk about any spoilers. I'm talking about things in broad terms. I'm going to make some allusions to this kind of twist that happens at the end, but won't spoil anything until we get well toward the end, and then I will warn you. Besson is being so bold. Not only is he going to talk about Proust, but he's going to give Proust language. He's going to give Proust a lot of dialogue. He's also going to give Proust a bunch of epistolary, segments. These are letters that are supposedly written by Marcel Proust. Part of me was like, wow, Besson is really going for it here, just by like being like, okay, I'm going to write in the voice of Proust. I'm sure he's not the first person to have done this, but I was so intrigued. I was like, how is he going to pull this off? I am someone who does not love the epistolary novel. We've talked about this also at length. Dangerous Liaisons by Laclos, that was an epistolary novel from the 18th century. Is that right? From the 18th century? I think it is. I think it's like late 1700s. Just looked it up. That was 1782. That is so interesting because I really don't think of, the novel. Well, obviously, one of the very first novels is Don Quixote. That's like 16, I'm going to say like 1605, right around the same time as Macbeth, which I think is always so interesting. Many people place that as the very first novel. But the realist novel, as we know it, doesn't really come, into its own until the middle of the 19th century. Of course, we have Jane Austen at the beginning of the 19th century, but it is always so interesting when we have something like Dangerous Liaisons that's kind of a precursor. The epistolary novel was, or the epistolary fiction at that point was something that was done a bit more. Dangerous Liaisons it's an epistolary novel in the sense that the whole thing is made up of letters back and forth. I never really love it because there's so many constraints. Like if you have one person writing a letter to one other person, you're very confined, or else meaning you can only say certain things that feel natural. It either feels contrived, like you're kind of like, remember that time when you and I were blah, 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 and just like all these things that you normally wouldn't write in a letter to someone, but also just the scope of it is sometimes too narrow. Importantly, recently we had that book by Virginia Evans called The Correspondent. That was an epistolary novel that really did work well and appealed to many, many people. But there we have this kind of kaleidoscopic view where we have all of these different letters from different people. I thought the epistolary element of this book actually worked very well because we have a few different people who are writing letters. There are a couple of surprising letters that come at the end that are kind of bombshells, no pun intended. And also I liked the epistolary part because it was only a small section, well, a decent sized section, but it was only one section. And we had already had a lot of like more straightforward prose that had kind of introduced us and set the scene and given us quite a bit of texture. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here with the letter writing part, the epistolary aspect of the novel. I'm going to back up a little bit and give you an agenda. It's actually a very simple agenda today. What we are going to do is I'm just going to talk kind of in broader terms about what I think is working really well. And we'll look at a couple quick chunks of prose just to demonstrate how well that is going. And some of these very bold elements that I think are really working in Besson's favor. We're then going to talk about some aspects that are maybe not working quite as well. Okay, so we're going to dive into all of the things that I feel are working really well here. And I'm going to run through this list very quickly, and then I'm going to go back and kind of fill in some specifics. First of all, the setting of the First World War, 1916. Second of all, this idea of adolescence. We have Marcel Proust, who is 45 at this point, but we have someone in his adolescence, which is always such a fertile time, to look at in anyone's life. We have issues of class, I think, that are working really well. We also have there's some kind of unusual things that he is doing, especially with dialogue. There's lots of like, I said, you said, I said, you said. And that to me, it felt very mature because it was kind of a departure from how most people do dialogue. I think that the sex writing here is very good. Sex writing is so hard to do. I had a teacher in my MFA program. She was so smart. And she's like, if you are going to write sex, just write what is happening. Just describe what is happening. We don't need metaphors. We don't need like big, long descriptions of how something felt inside someone's body. I mean, I don't mean like something actually inside someone's body. I mean like sensations. Like just stick with what's going on. And I think Besson is very good at doing that. Some of the writing is a little bit explicit in a way that I really liked. Like I think there was a good balance between being sort of like graphic enough, but also not having it feel gratuitous. I think he builds tension very well, which we're going to talk about in a minute. There's some nice kind of meta, very small kind of meta things that are happening. I thought he did a really good job of showing some internalized homophobia. The epistolary thing, as I told you, was great, I thought. And then the age gap thing, that was a real problem for some people, but I actually think he handled it very well. And then, of course, all of the stuff with Proust is very appealing. So to go back to the beginning, this idea of the First World War, it's such an amazing thing just to think about the fact, like in the absence of men, you have this, lots of times this is told, I'm thinking of Virginia Woolf here, it's told from the other gender. It's told, it's like women, sort of this whole generation of women where there are no men. And it's so interesting to pick someone who is too young for the war and someone who's too old for the war and just have that sense of just like an entire generation being lost. I thought that tension was so good. Because we have this nice shifting of perspectives, we have our main character, Vincent, of course, who is speaking. We have Arthur, who is speaking, and we have Marcel. They're all speaking. Most of the time, that is through the perspective of Vincent. He is quoting these other people as saying things, but we also hear their own voices in the letter section. And I really liked the way that we had like the weight of the war really felt very authentic. We had the way that the war was so difficult for his mother. We had some pretty graphic description of like not graphic, we had like detailed description of what trench warfare was like and just how ominous it was. And anytime you pull one person out of a war, and especially someone who is then describing a couple of the people around them and maybe how they died, you go from just thinking about trench warfare as like a concept to really feeling it, because you have someone, like one individual person who is young and who's compelling and gorgeous and vulnerable and interesting, and that person is telling you their experience, which of course makes the whole thing much more alive in many ways. And then moving on to adolescence, I loved this. Adolescence, I just think it's such a good time to like write about someone, but there's so much in flux and so much is changing, and people are really becoming, who they are, or at least beginning to become who they are. All sorts of stuff is happening in terms of relationship. And in this case, I loved how confident and bold and kind of mature this adolescent was. Vincent is someone who right from the beginning just like exudes this kind of self-possession and this kind of confidence. And it worked very well for me. I think some people might be like, wow, that was really actually like a lot of confidence for someone who is so young. But I do think there's some adolescents who just have that sense of like, first of all, being immortal, which is really important in a book that's all about the war. He's someone who has some gravitas. You have this sense of him as being very strong and kind of enduring in lots of ways, even though he's only 16 years old. And again, for me, that worked. I think there are some adolescents who just like think that they know everything and are very secure. That's a good segue into class. Part of the reason why I think that we have this kind of like self-possession and this kind of confidence in Vincent is because he is like this very upper class kind of Parisian boy. He has the particule, he's Vincent de l'Étoile. So you have the sense of him as being like this, not like aristocracy, but like, a couple steps down from that. That was part of the reason why I felt like he really would have had some confidence. We also have him in a relationship with a person who is the son of a servant. So you have this idea of class as being really interestingly stratified, and I really like the way that we have that kind of thing writ large. It's really interesting to me that like the main objection that the father, Vincent's father, has about the relationship is because of the class issues. It's not totally clear whether Vincent's father knows what else is going on, but the fact that the class thing is so objectionable, it kind of gives them cover in some ways to have the relationship, because I think maybe the father is it wouldn't even like occur to him that this is going on because of the class difference. That might be a little simplistic of a reading, but I really did enjoy the class part of it. I also liked how Proust kind of stood out as sort of like a category of his own, which is so excellent. This is a writer who at this point is a huge celebrity. I mean, this is very clear from the very beginning. He's like this very esteemed writer, someone who's very important in Parisian society. He's at the Ritz. He's fitting right in with this high class group of people, but truly is in kind of a class of his own. I really liked the way that those three different milieux, you have, Vincent, Arthur, and Marcel, all kind of inhabiting very different spaces. So the next aspect here that I have in my notes is that the sex writing was very good. And I want to read a little section of it. It is so funny. I read the book in the French, and when I went back, I marked a bunch of passages, and when I looked back and found them in the English version, it was the French part, the sex parts were so funny to me because they really did sound so much better in French. And I think part of that is because like the kind of like boldness of it was kind of obscured maybe. There was one section that I was going to read, and then I read it again, and there's like all this stuff about like your foreskin and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh my God, in English, that's just like a little bit harder for me to handle. So we're not going to read that section. Not that, I mean, it was very well done, but I was like, oh gosh, I'm going to have a hard time perhaps reading this out loud to my listeners. So we're going to read a little bit more of a tame section. But what's important here is the way that Besson is like helping us see what is happening. And he gives us a little bit of nuance, but he's doing exactly that thing where he's just telling us what is happening in a way that's really very appealing. So on page 61 of the English version, we have this. The movement of my hand to and fro on the nape of your neck, stroking your short hair, is one of perfect intimacy, a timeless gesture of lovers. It takes us to a place where no one else can go. After a time, my hand slides to your chin. I lift your face. I want your eyes to look into mine, to feel the infinite tenderness of a gaze, locked one by another, to speak to one another without words. In your eyes, I see at first a sort of sorrow, an absence. So I try to move forward, my gaze slipping inside you, effacing the sorrow, trying to bring back a flicker, a spark. And the transformation takes place. The flicker returns to your eyes, it comes from far off, and with it a smile, which sketches itself upon your lips. There it is. Now we can be together once more. Your hand reaches toward my face. You run your fingers through my hair. I have won you back. Now we need only fall back onto the sheets. And what's beautiful here is this is indicative of a lot of the writing. We don't, it's not like there's not a lot of description of penises and whatnot. It's a lot of this very intimate touching, which really speaks to the intimacy of the relationship. And I think it's very, very well done. So the next thing I wanted to talk about here is this idea of tension. So this was so well done. In the very beginning, we have Vincent meeting Marcel, and that's when this kind of age gap relationship comes in, and you're like, oh gosh, like, are we going to have a 16-year-old and a 45-year-old together? And we're definitely kind of heading in that direction, which gives you this real sense of tension. Like there's a real question there that the reader needs answered. Pretty soon we have the entrance, or like the addition here, of Arthur. And that was so skilled because fairly soon, the relationship between Marcel and Vincent shifts a little bit. And we have other questions that are coming up, more these questions of like, are their parents going to catch them? Is anyone else going to catch them? What would that look like? Much larger questions, of course, of like, how is their week-long thing going to end? And then what is going to happen with Vincent? That's another good segue into an excellent thing that he's doing here. Anytime a writer gives us a compressed sense of time, it is so skillful because you have this sense of tension, and also any reader, the human mind, likes limits on things. So we have this idea of like this kind of happening over this short span of time, partially just the week when the two of them are together because Arthur is on leave, but also this idea of like it's going to be a fairly short arc because you're talking about this kind of one season. It's also not a very long book, so you don't get a sense that we're going to be like epic here. We also have a lot of emphasis on mothers, and that was a very important thing from the beginning. I think the way that we have like the pain of the mother, I actually thought a lot about that because as a mom myself, I was like, wow, I would not be that psyched if my son came back from the front and then spent the whole entire week, with someone else. But I also understand how difficult it would be for the two of them to be together. The emphasis on the mother in the beginning, it functions very well simply as like showing us the tension and the like horror of what is happening, like the real, the biggest tension, which is this idea of war and whether or not this young man is going to be killed. But also the idea of mothers becomes much bigger as we get at the end of the book, and we have this kind of this turn, this twist that we have at the end. We also have a lot of emphasis on fathers, not a lot, but like a nice amount of emphasis, mostly to underscore class, but also to sort of give a sense that these two are not just floating out in the middle of space, that they're actually anchored by families. But of course, the presence of Vincent's father really underscores the absence of Arthur's father, which is a huge important thing, both for just Arthur as a person, but also in terms of the plot of the book. This is the kind of crafting that later I was like, oh, now I see what Besson was doing. Like I understand what he is doing with all of these different parental figures. I also really appreciated the fact that there was a certain amount of tension with their kind of secret meetings, but there wasn't so much tension. That wasn't the main thing. It wasn't like, are they going to get caught? Like it wasn't that kind of furtive, which I also really liked. I think we didn't need any more pressure on the two of them and kind of their time together. The next thing on my list about things that are going well is this idea of this kind of meta thing. Metafictive things are just like when you have the idea that what you're holding in your hand is the product of an author. Like this idea of being conscious of the fact that this is a written piece of art that we are holding in our hands. And usually it takes the shape of like someone in the novel is actually writing the novel, and you find out that this is the thing that they have been writing. And there is just one very brief mention of his cahier, his notebooks. So when we hear Vincent talking about his notebooks, you have the sense of like, oh, it's a very strong first person narrator where you have, I said this and I met Marcel and then I saw Arthur. All of these different things are happening in the first person. And it is really nice. There's a nice immediacy when we hear that these are coming from his journals. Also, when we have the letters, that's another piece of it that feels kind of meta in the sense that this is someone who is keeping his journals, his notebooks, but then also we have the idea of these letters as being like actual vestiges of the writing and the voices of these people. And I'm always a sucker for that kind of like brief mention, any kind of mention of like why I'm giving to you this like faithful and very like immediate and very clear depiction of what happened because I have the actual source material. The next thing that I think worked really well actually was there is quite a bit of internalized homophobia. We see it mostly on the part of Proust. He is warning our young Vincent against, getting really involved in this kind of relationship, and certainly against the idea of like going public with it. And those parts were kind of hard to read because, obviously you don't like anybody being like, I'm ashamed of this and this was terrible and you should not do this and everybody will freak out if you do this. But, Proust was born in 1871, and he was someone who was gay and had relationships with men, but he wasn't someone who ever publicly acknowledged the fact that he was attracted to men. And 1871, in 1971, we were still just like having a lot of problems with homophobia. And I think internalized homophobia is so difficult to read about. It's bad enough to have someone who's homophobic, but to have there be a time when someone would have like taken in that kind of feeling about himself or herself is just, it's really wrenching. And I liked the idea of looking at that kind of internalized homophobia with Proust in contrast to the way that Vincent is looking at this. There's some conflict certainly in the hearts of both Arthur and Vincent, but in that one generation, at least with these specific men, there really is a lot of progress. We don't have the same sense of like really deep shame that we have. And it's interesting because this is 1916 that this is happening, and in some of the other books, particularly Lie With Me in Besson, which is a book that was set probably in the late 20th century because it was autobiographical, and Besson was born I think in 1967, so it was probably in like the 1980s or something, but that was a time when homophobia was rampant. But there's a lot of depiction in that novel of really serious homophobia. So I like the way that this is taking up this idea of this internalized homophobia and is contrasting it with like the way that at least Vincent and Arthur feel when they're by themselves. This sense of like of accepting what is happening and really just like really investing in this intimacy, even though they know it is short-lived, and not foregrounding, at least in the text, any kind of conflict that they have. Vincent, with his kind of like self-possession and his confidence, all of that like reflects very nicely on his gayness, because he's very confident, and that extends to this idea of his choice of who he wants to be with romantically and physically. So I mentioned before that the age gap thing, it actually worked very well for me. This is something, when you look at reception of the novel or even comments and things, people are like, oh, the age gap thing was rough for me. And it is. Like in the very beginning, you're like, oh gosh, like we have this 16-year-old and this 45-year-old, and we are way too savvy at this moment in 2026 to see that as anything other than kind of predatory. But the main thing is the sort of the reality of that relationship. This is a little bit of a spoiler, but the fact that it does not become physical. And we find out fairly soon that the sexual desire that Vincent is feeling is for Arthur, not for Marcel. We have this idea of like, oh, phew, like we're not going to have like a full-blown physical relationship between this man who's 30 years older than this 16-year-old boy. But the other thing that happens is from the very beginning, Vincent is the one who is very much in control. There's a really moving and I think surprising and excellent scene where Vincent and Marcel are together, and Vincent really has this sense that Marcel is kind of putting on this kind of performance. And he very clearly and like very boldly is like, I will be your friend, but not if you keep like kind of performing in this way of like the grand, writer and society man. And so you have this sense of Vincent again as being very confident, being very bold. And it's really interesting. This is something we're going to look at in a second. A lot of what this book is Vincent being silent about things, certainly in the whole first part. And it is true that when he and Proust are together, there's a lot of talking that Proust is doing and not so much what Vincent is doing. In many ways, he's kind of silent. But there is a boldness and a confidence where he does seem like he is in control of these situations. He leaves the situation at different points. Like, we do not get the sense that he is this kind of naive, vulnerable young man. He, in fact, feels like someone who is very much in possession of his own agency. And that makes the age gap thing, I think, work much better. I also think it's important to represent things that are realities, and we can present them in all sorts of different ways. But I mean, this is a phenomenon, regardless of how predatory it is, that is a reality. And I like the tension in the beginning because you're kind of like, oh gosh, where are we going with this? And the last and most important thing of like elements that I think are working really well is the idea simply of like this very bold depiction of Proust. So we have his presence right from the start, and there's some things we know, like the cork-lined room and his relationship with his mother. There are a couple of things that everyone sort of knows about him already, but then there are all of these other nuances that are coming into play. And it's so nice to have this fictional depiction of him because he is such a huge kind of legendary, iconic writer. We have that a little bit about the history too. There are ways that this is that the novel feels very kind of floaty, and a lot of it is these two young men in bed together in these really beautiful scenes. So you have the sense of this as being timeless, but there are also ways that it is really grounded, in the world of Paris at that time, and certainly in like the trench warfare part. So there's some facts about Proust that I find so interesting, and then we have a couple of parts where Besson is like speaking about his work, about his writing in ways that I found so appealing. I want to take a look at one of them. In the English version, it's on page 121. I have decided in the end to read his books to know him better. He writes wonderfully about childhood, words that are tender and melancholy, which paint a picture of a world I should like to have known. I should like his past to have been my own, as I think he would like my future to be his. I am beginning to realize how much Marcel is, above all, a man turned entirely toward the past, as though he were looking for some golden age that is lost forever, as though he were trying to unearth fugitive emotions which he longs to feel once more. His work surveys the past, and he himself seems quite unfamiliar with the revolutions that have taken place these last years, especially in the field of art. He is an aficionado of Vermeer and Chardin, but has nothing whatever to say about Rimbaud or Picasso. Marcel is the antithesis of a modern. In spite of this, one would not think to reproach him for this, because one intuits, apart from his nostalgia, his keen sensitivity to suffering, his conviction that his happiest years are behind him, and that those years left to him serve only to bear witness to that lost time. So I love the idea of ending this paragraph with lost time. Obviously, In Search of Lost Time is like masterwork. And some of this is stuff that I think you would have intuited. Proust is someone, I haven't studied him like at length, but I certainly have read a lot of him. And the idea of him facing backward toward childhood, again, is something that a lot of people know. The Madeleine, like all of the sort of nostalgia that he has going back in time, thinking of his childhood, all of that is stuff that many people would have been familiar with. But then I like the idea of Besson layering on these other pieces of information, like comparing him with the modernists. You have Virginia Woolf in terms of literature, you have James Joyce. Those are people who, around the time of the First World War, this is a little bit before then, but you have this idea of all of the isms coming out, modernism and cubism and fauvism, and like all of these different ways of looking at art through these radically different lenses and these radically different, visions of what it is to sort of depict reality. And this is one of many examples where we have the idea of his work talked about in kind of a general way, but put into context that feels new and feels kind of, you feel like you're learning something about him, which is always excellent. And one of the other things about Proust that we see so beautifully done is when we have these letters of him, there are times when he kind of like waxes Proustian in the sense that he's, some of what the letters that he's writing to Vincent are very kind of straightforward, and some of them are warnings, and a lot of them are compassionate support because he understands that his young friend Vincent is going through something difficult. But some of the parts I liked the very best are when we have like text in these letters that feels very much like the writing style of Proust. We have those kind of long recondite sentences, we have lots of different punctuation, we have em dashes, we have lots of clauses that are all kind of built up. So on 125 of the English version, we have this. And this is part of this is like part of the internalized homophobia here. It's kind of warnings that he is giving to Vincent. I would also like to say that when I assert that those who love and those who are happy are not the same, I am simply calling attention to the fact that, often, in love, there is one who gives and one who takes, one who offers himself and one who chooses, one who reveals and one who conceals, one who suffers and one who survives. It is a cruel game because the dice are loaded. It is a dangerous game because inexorably one must lose. I expect that you will resent me just a little for inflicting these supposed truths upon you, truths which at worst you believe to be foolishness, at best to be realities which do not apply to you. Of course you will not believe that what I have said applies to you. You may even be tempted to accuse me of being a killjoy. For my part, I would not blame you for your mistrust nor your rebuke. This is sort of Proust kind of light in many ways. It's not difficult to understand. We don't have sentences that are pages long, but we do have this sense, this idea of this unorthodox punctuation, where instead of periods after any kind of independent clause, we have what are, grammatically like a run-on sentence. But it's so beautiful because there's an urgency. And the urgency here, of course, is that he's trying to warn his young friend. So when the sentence is going on and on, you have this sense of like really the emotion that is behind it. And it's beautifully done. And the whole time I was like, are we going to get, some of this like Proustian prose? And I liked the fact that it came in letters and that it wasn't too heavy-handed. It could have gotten into some sort of like almost pastiche if it were like really over the top, but it's controlled and I think, but also indicative of the ways that people identify Proust's writing. And in that way, it was delightful to come across these passages. Another of the things that I think is working so well here is that we have all of these subtle parallels between Marcel and Arthur. And I love the way that Vincent, as kind of like in relationship with both of these men, he's in relationship, in this romantic physical relationship with Arthur, and then this like very devoted friendship with Marcel. One of the things we're going to get to later is I was a little like, really, are Marcel and Vincent this close after just like 1 week of being together? Like part of me was like, this seems like a lot of intimacy for just like, a few meetings. But we have these beautiful similarities between the two. And when you have two characters who do have those kind of similarities, it's really good because it begins to underscore those elements in both of the people. So a few of the things that they share, both are facing the threat of death. We have a bunch of times where Proust is having these asthma attacks, and we know, in fact, that he is someone who is not well. He hasn't been well his whole life. And he really is feeling like the approach of death. And obviously, so is Arthur, but in a much more kind of acute way because it is so unjust because he's 21 years old. By the way, another way that the age gap thing works well is that like the 21-year-old together with the 16-year-old seems like nothing. Also, in wartime, I feel like things, because of the intensity and the threat and the reality of what's happening, that we can understand a bit better, some of these relationships that might be kind of outside the norms of social bounds. But again, the 45 and 16-year-old is a far cry from the 21-year-old and the 16-year-old. So they both, so Arthur and Marcel both have this idea of imminent death. They both are very concerned about their memory or their legacy, more Proust than Arthur, but we still have pieces of that, which is interesting. In both cases, their mothers are very prominent and their fathers are not. And again, that's an important plot point later. But it also just adds to the vulnerability. And it works both ways. In the case of Arthur, we feel so badly for his mother, and it really emphasizes the horror of the war. In the case of Proust, it gives you this sort of sense of his like inability to have grown into himself. We have the fact that both of them are gay men. I have here in my notes that both are hungry for Vincent, which is such a weird way to put that. I don't know why I have that there, but, not untrue. Oh, no. It says right here they're hungry for Vincent's words. I had a whole other word there that I wasn't reading. And it's true. Both of them are wanting Vincent to say more and to share more with them. And the reader is wanting that also. And we're going to talk about this in a second. It is both a strength and a weakness, I think, of the book that we don't hear as much of Vincent's voice as we might like. There are many, many times where Arthur's like, you're not saying anything. Why won't you say something? And Vincent is very quiet. I think the ultimate payoff with that is fine. We eventually do hear Vincent's voice. And when we do hear his voice, it's all the more compelling because we have been hungry for it. And in some ways, the reader is nicely aligned with Arthur and with Proust because we are also hungry for his words. We are not just hungry for him. We are not, in fact, hungry for him. We also have a way that in both of these cases, we have this young man who's kind of a catalyst for understanding important historical things. One is the First World War and one is Marcel Proust. So we've got this person who's not saying a lot, but who is like providing these questions and providing like almost like a microphone for these men to speak into. And these are historical moments that many readers are interested in, both the First World War and Marcel Proust. So we have this sense of both of them as having this unique vision on history. Marcel Proust is living himself. He is his own kind of phenomenon, but Arthur is living through the war. I'm not explaining this very well, but we have a way that both of them have they have information to share that the reader wants. The reader wants to hear about Proust and his inner thoughts, and we want to hear about the experience of the First World War. And so there's the parallel of both of them having information, and the reader as wanting Vincent to be asking these questions and in some ways being kind of a silent, partner where these men can do a lot of the speaking. I want to move on now and talk about the prose itself. I found it so interesting. There is a very distinct style that Besson has, and we see it in Lie With Me, but we definitely see it here. And it's interesting because it is so pronounced, and it's kind of this exaggerated style thing that he is doing, which we're about to look at. And for someone, as a first novel, it's really interesting that this is already so kind of developed, this voice that he has. But I would also argue that he's leaning on this kind of this structure that he has. He's leaning on it in a way that at times it can begin to feel a little heavy, a little repetitive. And what this style kind of rests on is this idea of repetition. And I like it when something is repeated over and over. It's also a very Proustian thing. But when you have any writer who is searching for a way to describe something, and certainly like describing the like really ardent physical and emotional, attachment between two people, it's a very difficult thing to express. So one of the ways you can do that is by repeating something over and over and modifying it as you're going. So we have a lot of repetition, often verbatim, of different things, and you'll have like paragraphs that are, phrases set off by commas. So it's phrase after phrase after phrase of trying to describe something. And then often in the same paragraph, you'll have this whole pile up of other elements, which we're going to talk about, kind of a repetition of ways to describe one certain thing. In that case, this pileup is not verbatim repetition. We have that toward the beginning of the paragraph usually, and then we'll have a pileup of a bunch of different either comparisons or adjectives that are seeking also to describe this thing. And this keeps happening to me recently. It happened with Lost Lambs. It happened with My Year in Paris with Gertrude Stein. I would find kind of a tick in the writing, something that wasn't sitting very well with me because it was overdone. And then when I would come to a lecture and want to read a section to describe why the writing wasn't as effective, I'd be like, wait, actually, this is very effective. And the reason why it was effective is because it's a good thing that the writer is doing. But if they're doing it over and over and over, you get kind of glutted and it starts to feel a little tedious, a little long, a little slow, a little lazy. It just becomes not as effective. So I want to look on page 28 in my American version here at an example of the prose and this kind of repetition and this piling up that he does. So on 28. And the thing that's being repeated here, very simply, is the word we, and certainly we at the beginning of a sentence. We do not part. We cannot bring ourselves to part. It seems impossible for us to separate. We are new lovers. We are exhausted and happy. How long we stay in my room while the fierce light of a glorious day filters through the louvered shutters, I cannot begin to reckon. How long we lie together in the sheets as they soak up our smell, our heat, I could not really say. I know that it could last a lifetime, that it could last until the end of this war, that it could last until evening. So here we have that repetition of we, which is very straightforward, but we also have this repetition here of like, I cannot begin to reckon, I could not really say. In that case, it's the syntax. Like he's saying there, how long we will stay in my room, I cannot begin to reckon. And then how long we lie together, I could not really say. So that same construction, like how long we X, I could not say. How long we Y, I could not say. That kind of repetition, I really like it. It's very dreamy and kind of lulls you into this kind of very nice sense of like, not relaxation exactly. And it's very sad, kind of, well, it's both sad and beautiful what he is saying here. And I really do believe that it's kind of the structure in these repetitions that are giving it this kind of like lyrical quality. I also really like the fact in the French, demeurons is like how we're going to stay here together, and then durer, I know it could last, durer, a lifetime. I was wondering when I was looking at the French if the translator was going to be able to preserve this sense of these words that are beginning with the D. And yes, he says how long we lie together, it could last a lifetime. So we have the repetition, not of a D sound, but of the same initial consonant, the L here. And then we have this very nice repetition of last. It could last a lifetime. It could last until the end of the war. It could last until evening. And that's especially beautiful because we're going from a lifetime to the end of the war to the evening. He's doing all of these really interesting things with this kind of repetition. Like, that is so beautiful because it's really talking, he wishes it would last a lifetime. It might, but then it also might just end until the war, and then it also might end that evening. We have this tension that is built into this real beauty and this like languor that we're having that's really created through the syntax and through this repetition. And then we have this pattern where he has that kind of repetition of phrases and of syntax, and then we move into this kind of pile up that I was talking about. In this case, these are nouns. And what these nouns are comparisons for their relationship, for the sensation of the two of them being together. And it's very nicely vague here because what he's saying was, I know that it could last a lifetime. It could last until the end of the war. It there refers both to their relationship, but also really does beautifully refer back to their exhaustion and their intimacy. So then it, in this case, is going to be defined by all of these nouns. So we have it could last till evening. And then he goes on, it is a madness, a fit of passion, something overwhelming. It is a revelation, a predestination, something which demands to be felt. It is a pleasure, a sweetness, something which makes one want to cry. I listen to the rhythm of your speech. I say nothing. My eyes are wide open, sweat beads on my forehead. My attention is fixed entirely on you. There is no space for anything other. I say nothing. I do not want to say something which will not measure up to this experience. You are the first man. So I think you can hear in the beginning, we have all of those structure, the syntax that repeats itself. We have that pile up in the beginning. It is a revelation, a predestination, something that blah, blah, blah. Then we have again, it is an X, it is a Y, it is something that blah, blah, blah. All of that is so beautiful. And then it kind of stretches out again. And I like the repetition here. I say nothing, I say nothing. I do not want to say something. So we have these slight variations, but we also have more repetition. So all of this, I'm talking about this in this context of things that are working very well. The prose does work very well in these kinds of patterns. The problem is when we have it over and over and over throughout the book, it becomes this like very identifiable thing where we have the syntactical kind of echoes of like verbatim phrases. Then we have the pile up of either adjectives or nouns. And sometimes the paragraph will end there, and sometimes there's like an extra part at the bottom. But it's enough of a pattern that it gets to feel a little bit predictable and just like a little bit tired. And the last thing I want to talk about that is working very well is something that English readers would not have picked up on. And this is the difference between the second person singular, because in French you have a formal version and an informal version. So you have tu, whenever he's talking about Arthur, it's tu dis, you say, you say, you say. And then when it is Marcel Proust, it's vous dites. So you have this idea of tu and vous. And so you have these very different registers. And it adds like a very different flavor to those things. And it's really so sad that you can't somehow, thank God the translator didn't try to do like, you, sir, blah, blah. Like there's no way to really do it in English. And I'm glad that the translator didn't try, but it is one of the things that works very well. As I mentioned before, the dialogue is not standard. Like in the middle of a paragraph that's like about something else, it's pretty dense. We'll have tu dis and then a colon, and then it'll have a bunch of dialogue that, for example, most of the time it's Arthur who is talking or Marcel who is talking. And each of those tu dis or vous dites, when you have those repeated over and over, it does really underscore the fact that one of these situations is informal, very informal, and one of them is much more formal. Okay, I want to move on and talk about some things that aren't working quite as well. One is that it does sometimes feel like these two men, either Marcel and Vincent or Arthur and Vincent, like they're kind of floating in space. And that is intentional in some ways. A lot of this just takes place in the bedroom. And we do have some description. In the beginning, there's actually a very beautiful description of a chair and the light in the room and some of the fabrics. I think it's the fabrics that are being described. We have some sense of a setting. And certainly with Proust, when they're at the Ritz, we have a sense of like the setting there. But I really would have liked more setting, not just because I'm a sucker for France, but because I think it really would have felt more grounded and a little more rich and interesting. I also think it might have added like another element instead of this kind of like all of this inner thought and all of this speech. A lot of this is like what they're thinking and then you say and then what the person is saying. It's a lot of dialogue and a lot of thought. I would have liked it to have been a bit more grounded in the actual scene, in the actual house, or the actual salon or the Ritz itself, actually. I would have liked a little bit more, or maybe even not more description necessarily, but more of a reminder of like the spaces that these people are in. And then the next thing in my notes about things that aren't going well is the exact same thing as things that were going well, in the sense of this kind of this structure that we have with all of the repetition and then the piling up. As I mentioned, it's both good and not so good when it is repeated so much. I have here that I'm supposed to read page 48 in the English version to show you, but I think I already showed you. So you have a sense of that. Probably on page 48, it's a little more extreme, these kinds of echoes of one another and then the piling up of the words that are meant to be comparisons. I am just really taken by the fact that this is his first novel, which it's astonishing because it's an incredible novel. But some of these things do feel very kind of like young author thing, like a little naive. Part of them are these plot points that to me felt a little contrived. So when at the beginning of the epistolary thing, suddenly Marcel has to go to his childhood home, and it makes some sense and it's kind of delightful because there is a lot of talk about how he is very kind of past facing and nostalgic, and he would go home. It's not unheard of that he would leave Paris for his childhood home. I'm certain that happened all the time, but it did seem very convenient that at the beginning of the epistolary part, once Arthur has gone back to the front, that we also have Arthur gone, so that we have suddenly these letters between the two of them. To me, anytime it feels like something happened just for the like stakes of the story or the convenience of the story, I'm like, really? Like this timing is awfully convenient. I also mentioned already, but this was a bit of a thing with me. I just didn't quite buy the intimacy that Proust and Vincent had right from the beginning. And whenever an author, like, you feel like they're kind of heading off a reader's doubt, and so if an author has that sense, they'll be like, okay, I'm going to either name it or I'm going to give some reason for it. And in this case, Besson like names it, but for my money, it kind of backfired because I was like, oh yeah, I was already thinking this, and this is not very helpful. So in one of the letters, Proust says, "When I think that barely a week ago we didn't know one another," I was like, yeah, exactly. And again, I think the like idea there was that he's going to be like, the reader is thinking like, how are they so close within 1 week? And he's like going to kind of head it off at the pass by being like, I can't believe it either. But for me, it just underscored that. So these are all small quibbles, but they're things that detracted a little bit from otherwise what I think is really excellent plotting. And the other major plot point here, which is a major spoiler. If you have not read the book and you don't want the ending spoiled, you should just zip yourself to the end of this lecture and not listen to this next part. But when we find out that Vincent is the son of Marcel Proust, you're like, what? Like, I gasped, which is a funny reaction for me. And then I kind of chuckled because I was like, really? This is not necessary. And I understand in terms of plot, like, he crafted it very carefully. There are all these things about how, Arthur was teased for not having a father figure. And there was a bunch of stuff about her being a sex worker. And at the end, we have the voice of the mom, which I really liked. And she's explaining, having been a sex worker. And it's very, in some ways, like a little too on the nose, but also kind of artful. When she's like, this man came in and he was someone who clearly preferred the company of men, but someone was pushing him to come to the brothel. And I had this experience with him. And like, then I never wanted to sell my body again. So, she's not a sex worker, which is a very important plot point, because if she is a sex worker, how could she possibly know that Marcel Proust is the father of her son? I mean, that's a kind of a big thing, and it feels a little contrived to me. If this is someone who was in such economically dire straits that she needed to do sex work, you're like, you did it just like the one single time and it happened to be Marcel Proust and you happened to get pregnant. All of that to me seemed a bit too orchestrated. The weirdest thing about that is it kind of worked. I was like, oh my God, this is not out of the realm of possibility. It just felt like it was a little bit too tidy. I also was engaged enough and I felt enough like emotion and enough a sort of investment in the whole thing that I didn't think this was necessary. This was kind of like this kind of gimmicky, like big like turn that happens at the end that felt really overstated. My son also really likes Philippe Besson, and I sent him a text that was all in caps, and I was like, I can't believe the end. And it was so interesting because he was like, what? Like, he didn't even remember, and he's a very good reader. He called and he was like, oh my God. He's like, it truly wasn't necessary, because in my mind, I kind of erased it. Like, it was so kind of over the top toward the end that it almost detracts from the rest of the novel, which is really very beautiful and kind of quiet, and this nice meditation on, the loneliness and the sadness of this older man who is this literary, genius and this literary superstar, but then also, the difficulties of the relationship between these young men. So it really didn't seem like we needed this whole thing, and apparently my son was able to just like block it out. So these plot points were things that to me felt a little contrived, but again, weirdly, it kind of worked for me. I was also a little weirded out, frankly. There's like some kind of thing in here about how, like that there is some sort of hereditary aspect of homosexuality, which we know is not the case. You do not, I mean, it's genetic in the sense that like you are born either being attracted to men or attracted to women, or both. But it is not something that you inherit. Like, we know that now. And, Philippe Besson, again, he's writing this in 1999. Maybe, I don't know, he couldn't just Google that, or that just wasn't something, I don't know, maybe those studies weren't even done yet. But it did kind of, I was like, what? Really? And actually, I think they should have probably edited that out. Like, I just was like, this is odd. And for me, that was like more of a detractor because it seemed like more of a statement that they were making about homosexuality that I was like, this is feeling a little bit odd. So I want to close today by saying the very best thing, and I made an allusion to this before, but I think one of the very best things about this novel is the fact that we have this young Vincent who has this really tragic experience of his first love, and yet what we have in Victor, oh my God, we get to the end and then I'm just like completely changing the name of the protagonist. With Vincent, we have this young man who is 16 years old who is not particularly conflicted about his homosexuality. He has this really beautiful and tragic, of course, but this really beautiful experience with this other person. I really loved the way that he seemed like he had come so far from the Marcel Proust character. And at the end, we get a lot of that. We feel a lot of the internalized homophobia on the part of Proust. And then we see the ways that for Vincent, I mean, he's being warned not to share any of this information. And we understand those impulses. But you also have a sense, you've already seen 150 pages of how this young man is really devoted, and he's not entirely comfortable in his skin, but that is not what is being problematized. We have more issues with like the war itself, of course, but also with class. It's showing progress in the sense of how a young homosexual man can feel about himself, like in the gap of the relationship between someone like Proust, who's born in 1981, and this young man who is born right at the turn of the century, in 1900. A lot is made of that he's born in 1900, and it's this kind of new era. It's interesting to think that it's almost exactly 100 years later that Besson is writing this. And if you have read Lie With Me, which is incredible, you know that Besson's, like his experience of being a young homosexual man in France was not easy. And I have to say, I'm a total sucker for all of these novels about young men in these tragic relationships. And all of them, to a certain extent, are examining the difficulties of being, a homosexual man in a highly like heteronormative patriarchal society. And I really liked the way that this one, even though it was, from 110 years ago, we have this sense that there has been some progress. And in some ways, it's not a book that is super problematized about the idea of men being gay. It's more this idea of like what the war is doing to them. Of course, there is also some of that other. So I really liked the idea of the progress. This was a book that I really loved, and I loved it all the more once I realized that this was Philippe Besson's very first novel. If you read this and you liked it and you have not read Lie With Me, oh my goodness, you have a gift in store. And I think we should just close with that. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.